Welcome everybody, thank you for tuning in to another review from our 2023 EMTB Shootout series presented by Fox Racing and Schwalbe Tires. Today we are going to be reviewing the Nukeproof MegaWatt. Make sure you guys check out the rest of the series on lots of other cool EMTBs. So let's get into the MegaWatt. So the MegaWatt is Nukeproof's first introduction to the EMTB market. It is a 170 millimeter front and rear wheel traveled mullet equipped e-bike. And I would say that this bike, it likes to shred and it likes to eat the chunk. So Robert, let's get into some of the geometry on the size large that we are testing.
Yeah, so the Nukeproof MegaWatt has got fairly middle of the road geometry, I would say. There's a 64-degree head tube angle up front, 77.5-degree seat tube angle. The wheelbase is 1,263 millimeters on the size large that we tested, which has a 475 millimeter reach and a 645 millimeter stack. Consistent across all of these sizes are a 442 millimeter rear end and 20 millimeter bottom bracket drop average because of the mullet wheels, which gives it a 345 millimeter bottom bracket height.
So this has a Shimano EP8 drive unit with a 630 watt-hour battery. Nukeproof offers 4 different models and various price points. So Robert, let's talk about the build and price we've got here.
Yeah, so as Drew said, Nukeproof offers a MegaWatt in 4 different build kits from $6,100 to $9,600. This is the $7,800 Nukeproof MegaWatt Elite. And the spec is mainly a mixture of Shimano SLX for the brakes and the drivetrain. Then you've got Fox Performance Elite 38 fork and a Float X2 Performance shock. And then the rest of the kit is pretty much Nukeproof own brand stuff. Their Horizon V2 wheels, Horizon cockpit, Horizon saddle. All certainly solid stuff, just nothing too flashy, I guess.
Now, obviously, price to performance ratio as well as the value debate, it's always a tough one for sure. You know, it's an SLX bike, it's $7,800. Granted, I don't think that's crazy compared to what other bikes are going for out on the market from a lot of other brands. Sure, we would love to see bikes as a whole come down in price, but I think for the performance, the motor, the size of the battery, the performance, right? There are things that you sometimes are paying for outside of just the componentry, right? And that is the ride quality and the engineering that goes into a bike like this. But what are your thoughts on how this bike sets up to the rest of the field?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's an alloy frame, SLX build. It's not super flashy stuff, but compared to the other bikes that we've got in the test, it doesn't seem crazy bad value. It just, yeah, it seems about right for the market, I guess, for an SLX build.
Yeah, it's tough because there's obviously some bikes like the Ibis, for example, which has got a build, I would actually say worse than this.
Definitely comparable, if not, yeah.
Yeah, and that bike is $11,000. Yeah. But then you've got the Foray, which has got a much better build and also pretty close to price as this bike. So, but then again, if we kind of just go across the whole field of bikes out on the market, you know, I think it's not crazy what they're asking compared to everybody else. So let's move on from spec and models and get into the performance on the trail. With climbing being the first thing, right? Because typically before you get to the awesome downhills, you got to climb there. 475 for me at 5'11" is definitely my sweet spot. 475 to 480 reach, I love. Robert at 6'2". We got to remember our friends overseas. Can you tell us what that is?
189 centimeters.
Thank you very much. How do you feel on this, comfort-wise, reach-wise?
Yeah, it's definitely not a super stretched out riding position. It is a fairly cramped cockpit, I would say, from me at 6'2", 189 centimeters. The seat tube angle is fairly steep, and then that 475 reach is definitely on the bottom end of what I would choose to ride. But that said, pretty comfortable.
Yeah, and once you stood up over it for the descents, didn't hold you back?
No, not at all. Certainly feels fairly well balanced between the wheels. The rear end is on the shorter side, but not short. So you don't struggle too much with keeping front weight on the front wheel. Yeah, I think it's fairly solid geometry.
Yeah, and again, for me at 5'11", 475 is great. It sort of blends that kind of comfortable seated position, but still keeps it short enough to where the bike is. We were kind of talking about this earlier. Right? I wouldn't call the bike sprightly or overly playful, but it's definitely not muted and dull.
Yeah.
It's not lethargic on the trail. Like it's a fun bike.
Right in the middle of everything, I would say.
Across the board.
Across the board, you don't feel too bad charging hard, going fast, but then when it gets really tight and technical, it also still maneuvers fairly well. Yeah, definitely doesn't isolate itself at either end of the spectrum.
Yeah, so let's get into strengths and weaknesses. I felt like, as much as we're saying this bike is kind of middle of the road, which some people might view as, you know, a bit of a down point, I don't necessarily think it is, because I think that really means it will work well for a broad range of riders on a broad set of terrain.
Yeah.
For me, though, there were a couple of things that stood out. On the negative side, I love technical trails. You might call them awkward, old school, janky, whatever you like to say.
That's exactly what you call them.
But I found climbing this bike over stuff, you know, obstacles, rocks, roots, whatever, I found that I was really striking pedals quite often, hitting the crank arms, and that was a bit of a downside. The upside was it was incredibly comfortable climbing. So, you know, if we got into sections of trail that didn't have really big rocks or obstacles, but it was more like washboardy or like small chattery like sandstone or roots, it just floats over stuff, really making that like all-day comfort scenario happen. And that's far from an amazing saddle by any means, right? So like the suspension platform is definitely doing work. On the downhills, I felt that same comfort and smoothness was present. It really erased the chatter. High speed, like washboard frequencies, square edge bumps, I thought it did well, and was still progressive enough to, you know, where your landing drops to flat or, you know, larger jumps, the bike would still hold up quite well. And I think you felt some of that as well, and obviously being at a little bit more weight, when you went to set up the bike, you kind of experimented taking that a little farther and reducing the sag a little bit more. Tell us about your experience when you did that.
Yeah, so I think the reason, a lot of the reason that you were feeling, and I was feeling it too, the climbing being comfortable but not necessarily the easiest to get up technical stuff, is that this has got a very low anti-squat level. So that means that you're not getting the same level of support from the bike as you're pedaling it, which means that the bottom bracket is moving a little bit more. So when you're doing those technical maneuvers, those cranks are getting closer to the ground, which makes it a little bit more difficult. But on the flip side of that, because the bike isn't standing up so much, it's more comfortable. The rear wheel is able to move more freely through the rougher terrain when you're pedaling it, which keeps it more comfortable on the way up and the way down, and probably gives you a little bit more traction too when you're pedaling.
And of course there is the climb switch.
Of course, yeah,
so
if you do
you
that.
could firm it up.
For sure, yeah. Not something that we like to make use of when we can help it, but definitely good to have there. Yeah. And it's nice and easy to reach as well on the MegaWatt. Then I kind of, to try and offset that fairly low BB height, I mean, we're riding a lot of technical climbs here where I'm struggling quite a bit for pedal clearance on a lot of bikes just because I suck at technical climbing up rocks. So I tried to go from a 25%, up to a 25% sag instead of the 30 to 35 that Nukeproof recommends, and that obviously improved the pedal clearance, but then I did start to feel some harshness creeping in on the descents. So I definitely think if you're going to be trying to charge hard on this bike, the 30 to 35% that Nukeproof recommends is probably the kind of way that you want to go on it.
Yeah. So I think as a whole, a pretty solid bike. I guess for a pretty broad set of riders, I would say if you're regularly spending time in very large obstacles, whether it be tall roots or tall rocks, you like that kind of techie climbing, or even descending where you come out of a corner, right, and you're out of the saddle and you're wanting to get those pedals in, if there's rocks and roots, it was a little unnerving. Granted, there's a lot of people who don't ride trails like that, right? And in those scenarios, or I should say, and excluding those scenarios, this bike absolutely rips.
Yeah.
It is fast, it is fun, it's at home just about anywhere. Like on some of the flatter, mellower trails, it was great. We took it to some really steep, marbly loose chutes. Obviously, you know, had some fun on some big new school berms and jump trails. It's a very well-rounded and capable bike. I think the low BB could be an issue for some riders, and that suspension kind of, you know, the anti-squat would be something worth noting for a small majority or minority of riders. But other than that, a really solid bike overall. Where does it sit for you?
It's just so middle of the road for everything. Yeah, in terms of what we've tested otherwise in the Shootout, again, sort of middle of the road. It's so sort of, it doesn't stand out in any way in any aspect of its handling so much that it maybe almost falls back into the background compared to some of the other bikes that have got potentially more exciting characteristics about them. But
some of those bikes have larger drawbacks that make them a little more specific or pointed.
Exactly.
And then that can bite that depending on the consumer or their trails too. So overall, I think pretty much everyone in the group felt like if it was their turn to get on the Nukeproof, they weren't bummed,
no,
right?
Definitely not. It's a fun bike to ride for
Absolutely. Sure. So there you have it, the Nukeproof MegaWatt. A really impressive first attempt for an e-bike from a brand, I think, right?
Yeah, definitely. Everything is solid on it. There's nothing
Yep.
you can complain about too much.
Solid machine. So if you guys are in the market, you're looking for a 170 mullet e-bike, and you're not spending a ton of time bashing through rocks or tall roots, definitely give this thing a check. Also, guys, please be sure to check out the rest of the reviews from our e-bike shootout series this year, and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see you back for future videos. Thanks for watching.